Thank you all for joining us. We're really excited to have you here for our first session to start off our grad school showcase week, where you'll be learning all about, what is grad school? Is it right for me? What are the things that you need to do to be competitive? And so many more topics. And we'll kind of talk about that a little bit at the end as well. So today you'll be hearing from me and Dr. Van Wallendael, and we're both, of course, in the psychology department, and we'll be talking a little bit more about whether or not graduate school is right for you. So I know that most of you are, this weekend, we're kind of targeting those freshmen and sophomores. So most of you are probably our freshmen and sophomores, and maybe are already thinking about, am I going to go to grad school, or would this be a good choice for me? So first of all, it's great that you're already thinking about this. Could never get started early enough, really, with thinking about graduate school. All right, so here's a little outline of what we're going to talk about today. So first, we'll talk a little bit more about what exactly is grad school like, and how is it different than being an undergraduate. We'll talk about how difficult it is to get in. So how competitive are these programs? And we'll touch a little bit as well on the differences. So there are different types of graduate programs and what these different programs mean. We also have a whole session on that tomorrow that will really get into that in a lot more detail. And finally, how do I know which types of programs are a good fit for me, and where could you find more information? So the first things that, just to kind of get us thinking about today. So, would I like graduate school? So as you're thinking about whether or not you're going to go to graduate school, or maybe why you're considering it, think about, why would I like it, or what would I gain from that? And then another thing to think about is, would I be successful? So what are some things that you could kind of look at now or throughout the course of your undergraduate career to see, okay, this is how I'm doing now. How will that translate into graduate school?
So basically, what I wanted to talk about, it's obviously been a very long time since I was in graduate school, but I think some things never change. And sort of started thinking about, what do I wish someone had told me when I started looking at graduate school? And there were a lot of things that were surprising when I got into grad school. And Jordan can probably say some of the same sorts of things. But one of the main things to realize is that graduate school is not really just like a continuation of undergraduate. I think I expected that it would be, the same sort of thing where I would take classes and I would, do work and take exams, and that it would be like undergrad, but maybe a little harder. But what I didn't realize was that grad school is more of a qualitative difference from undergrad. It's just a different type of experience. It's not like more of the same. So one of the things is that it's much more specialized. So you're used to taking classes now, and especially if you're a freshman or sophomore, you're taking general ed classes, you're taking classes in your minor as well as your major. So you're used to a lot of variety in terms of the classes that you're taking. And in grad school, you would definitely have more of a situation where you're only taking psych classes. And in fact, the further you go, the more you will only take classes in very narrow and specialized area of psychology. So that takes some getting used to. Um, and you should expect that the time commitment is much greater in graduate school. Nowadays we tell you as an undergrad that you should set aside 2 hours for every hour that you spend physically in a classroom. It's way more than that in graduate school. The reading load for what you will do to prepare for 1 week's graduate class can be many hours. And the topics are more challenging. They expect you to go into a lot more depth, and they expect you to do a lot more on your own. So, you won't have a lot of guidance necessarily about what you should do in addition to just doing the required readings. You may have kind of a seminar style class where the students more or less lead the discussion, and you're really expected to not just read the assigned readings, but probably go into some additional research as well on the same topic. And it's very research focused. You will not have textbooks by and large. You will tend to be reading the original journal articles, as opposed to someone else kind of digesting that for you. And for me, at least, that was a huge thing to have to get used to, that, the reading was much more difficult, and you really had to, it might have just been, 2 or 3 20-page articles that you had to read, which didn't sound like that much page-wise. But in fact, you would have to really, dive into the statistics and maybe read it 3 or 4 times to try and figure out what they meant by something. So you really wind up diving into the research much more than you ever did as an undergraduate. Jordan, would you say that's still a fair statement?
Yeah, I think definitely. And just to add, to what you're saying, I think a few other differences too. So especially in psychology classes at UNCC, generally you're used to these really large classes, right? And so other than maybe, research methods, I think we usually have about 25. And then if that's of course just for our psych majors. And then psych majors will also take that senior seminar, and those are usually capped at 15. So those would be probably your only smaller psych classes that you would have. So in graduate school, the classes are much smaller. And so getting back to what Dr. Wallendael was saying, a lot of those classes are going to be very discussion based. And so, you won't just be sitting in a room with a lot of people taking notes. You will still be taking notes, but it will be very discussion based, and you'll be expected to partake in those discussions. Another difference that I would talk about a little bit is that, and kind of I think getting back to the large classes versus smaller classes thing, is that in graduate school in psychology, often you're going to have a lot of papers that you're writing. And as an undergraduate, you have, again, maybe that research methods, the senior seminar, and you may have a few papers in other courses as well. But in graduate school, that's, much more of the focus. And I would say in most of the graduate classes I took, sometimes we didn't even have exams, it was really all writing based. So that would be another difference, that maybe you're used to taking more, multiple choice types of tests. You're probably not going to have that in grad school, but instead you would have research papers that you would be writing, or if you do have exams, oftentimes those will be written and not those multiple choice types of questions.
Yeah, and they're really focused on, if you have an essay or a take-home exam in graduate school, um, you better be very, very focused on detail and on really backing up every statement you make. So I know as an undergrad, a lot of times, if you run into an essay that you're really not sure of an answer on, you can kind of pull something together that sounds good, and you're hoping that you'll get some credit for it. You do not get away with that in graduate school.
And another thing that's kind of nice, again, goes back to these large classes. So in grad school, you'll have because you do have these smaller classes, and generally you'll be in a cohort, meaning you're kind of coming in with the same group of students. You'll really get to know these people and build relationships. I think that's something that's really positive about graduate school, that oftentimes when you're in, a major that's so large or having larger classes, you may not really connect with your peers, or you certainly may not have like the same people in all of your classes. But generally in graduate school, you'll tend to see the same people in, almost if not all of your courses. So that could be bad, but I personally found that to be a good thing.
So, some of you may have friends and classmates who are pre-med, and they're probably always talking about how hard it is to get into medical school and how they have to keep their grades up and so forth. So just to kind of give you a sense of where PhD programs fit in that particular range of, things that we all know are hard to get into. Medical school, depending on the quality of the school and the popularity of the school, acceptance rates can be anywhere from like 3% to about 12%. So you figure somewhere between 1 in 10 and 1 in 20 applicants get in. Veterinary school is notoriously tough to get into. Average there is again a little under 12%. Law schools vary a lot. The really top law schools that will get you into the high-paying law firms have pretty low acceptance rates. But some of the others have, acceptance rates as high as like 1 in 3. So they're actually not the hardest thing to get into. Psychology, on the other hand, if you are interested in clinical psychology, you are interested in one of the toughest types of programs of all to get into, anywhere from a 2% acceptance rates to 10% acceptance rates. So 1 in 10 are the easier schools to get into. Other kinds of psychology PhD programs, though, vary widely. While the average is around 13%, so around those kind of medical school rates, they can vary widely depending on whether you're looking at neuroscience or general psychology or social psychology. You might have like a 1 in 20 chance of getting in, or you might have, something better. And master's programs do tend to be easier to get into on the whole. So if you're looking at, let's say, something like a developmental master's program, acceptance rates may be as high as 48%, so almost half. School psychology, a little above half. On the other hand, there are still some areas that are pretty tricky even at the master's level. So if you're interested in neuroscience or more biological psychology types of programs, it's still about maybe 1 in 5 people get in. And if you think, oh, well, that doesn't sound so bad, if I have like, a 1 in 2 chance or even a 1 in 5 chance, I can definitely handle that. But remember that it's really only the top undergrads that tend to apply to graduate programs. So, when you're looking at, oh, I have like a 1 in 5 chance of getting into a neuroscience program. Well, yeah, but the other 4 out of 5 people that you're competing with there are all people very much like you. They're all highly motivated. They're all good students. So you really need to start thinking early about the kind of qualifications that you need to start putting together if you're going to get into a master's program or a PhD program.
Yeah, and just to echo that, so again, seeing these numbers, I think can be maybe a little discouraging, right? But again, it's just to give you kind of an idea of how competitive these programs can be, and to just, if this is the path that you want to go on, then really making sure that you're prepared and that you're able to make yourself a competitive applicant whenever you do go to apply.
Yeah. And at this point in your college career, you're at a really good place to be starting to build up the qualifications that you're going to need. So if you just look kind of at the minimum qualifications for most master's programs, typically you're looking at a minimum 3.0 GPA, so a B average, both your overall average and within psychology, they'll usually ask you to pull that out. But that's just the minimum that schools will look at. The average GPA for people who actually get accepted is 3.5. And remember, that's an average. So you're going to have some people who are above that, some people who are a little below that, but still above 3.0. GRE scores are starting to be required a little less, but by the time you get out, there's probably still going to be a lot of programs that will require GRE scores, and they typically want you to be at least in the top half of people who are taking the test across the nation, so above the 50th percentile. And that's just what you want to have again at the minimum for a master's. But if you want to talk about, clinical psychology PhD programs, again, those very highest level, very most difficult programs to get into, typically the people who apply on the average have a GPA of 3.7 or higher. That's about 3 out of 4 people who apply to clinical psych programs. So if you're anything less than that, you know that you're going to be in the bottom quarter to start out with in the application process. And they typically have GRE scores that are at the 70th percentile or higher. So if you think about, if most everyone who applies to a clinical psych PhD program has these very high GPAs and high GRE scores, and yet, 1 in 10 are making it through, you really need to think about, okay, what makes that top 10% better than all the other people with 3.8 GPAs and GRE scores at the 75th percentile, because 90% of those people who apply are going to get turned down. So, the thing to be thinking about now is, you know, yes, you're going to want to keep your GPA up there. Yes, you're going to want to, really work on those test scores and do the best you can there. But you really need to start thinking about what makes the top 10% of applicants stand out. And those oftentimes are things like research experience, and particularly those students who have gotten into research early enough that they've been on a research team where they've been listed as a co-author on a presentation at an academic conference, or maybe a co-author on a publication that looks really good, or they have perhaps teaching assistant experience or significant practicum or volunteer experience. So they can say that they've actually worked in the field, not just as somebody who maybe, sent out text messages or emails asking for donations, but somebody who's actually, worked with clients in some capacity, had some kind of supervised practicum experience. And UNC Charlotte does have a very good undergraduate practicum program where you can get the kind of volunteer experience with a supervisor who is trying to train you and a faculty member who is, making sure that your experience is meaningful. Um, and that's really where you can get the kinds of things that'll make your application stand out. So think about, as soon as you get through research methods, finding a research team to join. And when you do well in a class, think about approaching the professor to see if they need teaching assistants for the following semester. There are lots of ways here that you can really make your application look better than just your average person who, quote unquote, just has the 3.8 GPA or just has a high GRE score.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that too. So, research experience is never a bad thing, right? Even if you're just looking at master's programs, it's always a really good thing to get involved in. And for I don't know why the chat window is not coming up. And for the PhD programs, that's really critical. Like you're probably not going to get in if you don't have that. So, just as Dr. Wallendael said, as soon if you're, especially if you're looking at those PhD programs, as soon as you can, try to get into a research lab and start gaining that experience. I'll share too. So one of my best friends, she is a school psychologist, so she has her PhD in school psychology, but she did well as an undergrad. I think her GPA was probably around 3.7. But her GRE scores were really bad, like really, really, really bad. But she had a lot of research experience, and she even took a year off after undergrad and worked in a research lab for a year, and she was accepted to a doctoral program after that. So if you do find yourself having maybe lower scores in some of these areas, while that's not great, it doesn't mean that you would have no chance, but it just, I think, again, highlights the importance of gaining those research experiences and other sort of applied experiences that you can get.
Yeah, and even whether you're applying for a master's program or a PhD, very often good letters of recommendation are going to be critical. And someone who has just had you in a class where you got an A, even if it was a small class like a seminar, is not necessarily going to be able to write you a super strong letter. But if you have TA'd for someone, or if you have worked in a research lab, those are the people who are going to get to know you well enough that they can write a really strong letter of recommendation that'll say something that, you can't just look at in a transcript and figure out.
So we have one question. Could you explain how to get involved in more research at UNC Charlotte?
Yeah, so I'll talk a little bit about that, and there will be a session later this week, and we'll talk about that at the end that will really, really touch on that. So as Dr. Wallendael said, so if you are a psych major, typically faculty like for you to have taken that research methods sequence. So take those courses as soon as you can, and once you're through research methods 2, at that point you would be sort of ready to apply to work in a research lab. You can go ahead and start thinking about that now. So if you like go to our webpage and you go to, I think it's people, faculty, and you can click on people and see faculty in the department and see what kind of research they're doing. And some people, there will just be a little blurb right there on the web page. Others will have a link that takes you to the web page for their lab. So that can kind of give you an idea of what types of research faculty are conducting, what types of topics are covered. And so again, I'd say to be sort of competitive for that, you would want to make good grades, be sure that you do well on those research methods courses. And again, whenever you have those completed, go ahead and start looking into that. Don't wait until your senior year, right, to get involved in that. So that's kind of a good first step for getting involved in research. And generally, when you're working in someone's lab, not only are you going to, gain those experiences in terms of maybe you'll help with data entry, maybe you'll help develop some surveys, you'll be part of those weekly sort of lab meetings that they have. But it can also open up other opportunities that Dr. Wallendael touched on, like maybe you can be a co-author on a manuscript, or you might have the opportunity to present on a poster at a conference. So those are really, really valuable experiences to have.
The one other thing is, when we talk about GPA, GPA is really another thing that you really want to start early on in terms of, establishing a solid GPA. Something that I think a lot of people don't recognize is that it's harder than you think to bring your GPA up dramatically in your final semesters as an undergraduate. For one thing, your applications to grad school will often be due in late fall or at the latest early spring of the year before you graduate. So your GPA really needs to be where you want it to be by the end of your junior year. And if, let's say, at the end of your sophomore year, you have like a 2.8 and you're trying to bring it up over 3, you may think, oh, well, I'm just really going to buckle down and get straight A's and I'll, bring that up to 3.5 or 3.6. But that's probably not mathematically possible by the time you get 60 credit hours. Even straight A's, basically, for your junior year will only pull that 2.8 up to about a 3.2. So you're gonna be looking by the time you hit the end of your sophomore year at at most like a 0.3 or so boost in your GPA by the time that you get to the point where you would be ideally applying to grad schools. So if you think, that your first couple semesters don't count that much, they really do. Not trying to be discouraging, because a lot of schools will in fact ask you separately for your overall GPA and then maybe ask you like what it was for your last 2 years. So if you have had a dramatic improvement, particularly if there's some like reason for it that you could explain in your cover letter, then they will look a little more favorably on a GPA that was solid at least for the end of your career. But if you remember the kind of people that you're going to be up against when you're applying for graduate schools, then you really don't want to have anything that looks like a downside to your application. So you want to be thinking about getting a lot of those A's and B's at the start of your college career. And something that I always hear about from students who are trying to get into grad school, if you've got maybe a low GPA or you really did badly on the GRE, and you think, well, I know there's always a backdoor. I know I can just take some classes in the program and prove myself and then I'll get in. There really isn't any backdoor. There might be in other fields. I don't know about that, but there really isn't in psychology. And there's a reason for that. When most people think about a backdoor, they think about going in and taking some graduate classes before they're admitted to a program. But you can't signing up for graduate classes isn't just a matter of like undergraduate getting accepted post-baccalaureate and just signing up for classes. Everything in graduate school is typically restricted by permission of the department or permission of the instructor. And they typically only give those permissions to people who are actually in the program, particularly for the really core classes that are central or that are required for the degree. You might be able to get permission to take like an elective class if you're really lucky. But you probably won't get to take enough graduate courses to quote unquote prove yourself. You really do need to meet the criteria to be accepted into the program. And don't assume that, you know, there'll be some way to get in outside of those channels.
All right, so I'm going to touch briefly now on the differences in the program type. So the first big difference is the master's versus PhD. And you've heard us talk a little bit about that today. And probably what you've taken away from that is that maybe the master's is a little bit easier to get into than the PhD. So for our master's programs, those are generally going to be 2-year programs. Those are typically going to be more applied. So what that means is, you know, typically those are programs that are designed that you will have, you know, some kind of skill that you can kind of then go out into the workforce. Master's programs, again, they can still be research focused, right? And oftentimes students who are interested in PhD programs will first do a master's, and that's just a way to really gain additional research experience. So it's not that all of those programs are super applied. Again, it can just be that those are a way to get more research experience. So these are just kind of some examples of things. So social worker, therapist, counselor. Again, you could have sort of a general research master's in psychology, cognitive science. So really those can take, you know, a lot of different directions. And often, so if you are thinking about something like counseling or therapy, generally with a master's degree, and I'm not super knowledgeable about, I'm not a clinical psychologist, so I don't know all of that information, but I believe there may be some states where you can work, you know, with just that master's degree. Generally, that will involve some kind of additional licensing that you have to get after the master's. But for other states, you have to have, if you want to be, you know, a clinical psychologist, you do have to have that PhD. So PhD programs are generally 4 to 6 years, and it seems like a pretty wide range, and that's kind of depends on the type of program. So if you're looking at a program that's more research focused and less clinical focused, those maybe tend to be a little bit on the shorter side, so maybe closer to that 4 years. Programs that are more clinical focused tend to be longer just because there are more, you have to have certain number of clinical hours and things like that in order to complete that degree. And some of that also just depends on the student and, you know, how quickly are you completing your milestones and moving through that program. So there is a bit of variability there. PhD programs are usually always going to be research focused. So even clinical programs are still going to be focused on research. So there's still going to be an expectation that you are, you know, completing a thesis and a dissertation. So again, don't think that just because it's clinical that there wouldn't be a research focus. That's still absolutely a part of that PhD. And some examples of careers with a PhD could be, as I mentioned earlier, a clinical psychologist. There's lots of jobs in research that would require the doctorate. There are some as well that you could have with just the master's. You may also, you know, all of us who are working in, you know, in the psychology department, most of us have our PhD. So academia is another kind of popular career choice or pathway for those with the doctorate. So just a few other sort of terms that we can think about differences. So clinical versus counseling programs. Now, clinical programs, these are going to be more research focused. These people may work with more severe pathologies. So, you know, just for example, schizophrenia or something like that. It's not to say that these individuals wouldn't work with people with things like depression or anxiety, but that they may have sort of additional training that allows them to work with those with more serious pathologies. Clinical psychologists are usually conducting a lot of assessments. So these could be, you know, assessments related to different diagnoses. It could be related to, intelligence tests, personality tests. So lots of different types of assessments that you would be trained on in the clinical program, and that then, these people would be doing kind of in their daily work. Counseling, you can think of this as sort of more of maybe what comes to mind when you think of like talk therapy. So these people may tend to work more with those with things like depression, anxiety, PTSD. Again, it's not to say that they may not work with people with other types of conditions, but they may focus more, on these types of areas. And those with who go into the counseling field, again, they may be conducting some assessments, but that probably wouldn't be as varied or kind of the wide range that a clinical psychologist might be conducting. All right, and so the last thing I wanted to talk about was, okay, how do you find information about programs, right? So maybe generally what you're interested in, you want to go to graduate school, but you're not really sure like where to find information about programs or how to know, what program is right for me. So Google is everyone's best friend, right? So you can always just go to Google and type in information. So let's say, I were really interested in developmental psychology. I could go on Google and type in, you might be able to find something like if I typed in top, master's programs or top PhD programs in developmental psychology. Perhaps there's a website that'll come up that might, sort of give me a list of programs. Another thing that you can do is if you have specific schools or programs in mind, you can take a look at their websites. So again, just Google the school. You could go to the website and just read a little bit more about the programs that they offer and the focus of those programs. And that kind of takes me to this point. So for example, like a lot of places will have, for example, masters in psychology, right? And so on first glance, you might say, oh, I want to do a master's in psychology. This would be a good program for me. But it's really important to really look at, okay, what is the focus of that program? So there are some masters in psychology programs that perhaps have more of a social psychology bent, or that have more of a focus on cognitive psychology, for example. So it would be important to look into that, because if I'm interested in developmental, I don't want to go to a program that maybe is really focused on cognitive, for example. And that's something that you can usually find, again, just on the program website. Sometimes programs, even master's programs, will have like concentrations or different tracks, so you could kind of get more information about maybe the sort of subspecialties that way. Another thing that you can do is just check out the faculty research in that department. And so this can kind of be a good clue as to, if you're finding that most people are doing research, say in social psychology and cognitive psychology. So if you were interested in developmental, then, it doesn't seem like that would be the best fit for your interests. So that would just be another thing that you can look through to see, what are the topics of research that faculty here are generally conducting. And in terms of how do you know if it's right for you? So I would do like all the things that I just suggested. But I think the first step is really, again, like, what is it that you're interested in? What are you hoping to do for your job? What population are you hoping to work with? What kind of setting do you see yourself in? And so once you have that information, you can really start looking through, different programs and the different sort of subfields and specialties, and saying, okay, I know I'm really interested in this area. What programs are out there that, that would give me the degree in this particular area? So we will just open it up now. If anyone has questions, you can feel free to speak to those questions, or if you want to send them through the chat, that is fine as well.
So Sophia asks, what is some advice for people who don't know what field of psychology they want to hone in on?
Okay. So Sophia, one thing that I would recommend, assuming that you're interested in psychology, or really whatever field you might be interested in, if it's related, whenever you're taking your classes, think about like, or just as you're taking your classes, you'll kind of see, what interests me. So for example, if you're in a general psych class, you may find a couple of the topics particularly interesting. So generally, and kind of going along with that, if there is something that seems interesting, then try to take a course in that topic, and that will kind of help you to see, okay, is this something that I'm, interested in, or was it something that I'm not as interested in? You want to add to that, Dr. Wallendael?
Yeah, I was just going to say that as you start figuring out, what maybe interests you, maybe there's just a particular section of a chapter, or, there's something, there's a particular study that you read about that you thought was really cool. Don't be afraid to actually reach out to the people who are active in that field already. So for instance, if you take a class and you're reading about a particular, area of social psychology or developmental that's really cool, get on search sites and try to find some current research articles on those topics. And then as you find things that sound cool, take a note of who those authors are and just Google them and see, where are they working right now. You can usually, pretty easily find their contact information and drop them an email and say, hey, I just read your paper on such and such. I'd like to find out more about this area, or what are you working on now? Because sometimes you can make some really interesting contacts that way that can be really helpful when you actually start looking at graduate programs later.
Okay, and next question is from Ashley. I'm personally interested in ABA therapy, but I'm not sure where to start.
Do you know much about that question, Dr. Wallendael? I don't know that.
No, I don't. So neither one of us are clinical psychologists, so Dr. Lyerly and myself are probably as least knowledgeable here, but I would say, some of the same things that Dr. Lyerly said earlier regarding, Google for starters, and, find people who are doing research in this area and find out where they are, and start a conversation.
And you can generally find at least information about like the process, or what kind of program that you would need to apply to. So I have an honor student right now who is interested eventually in going on to a clinical PhD. So I've not really been able to like give her advice on that per se, but I can kind of direct her. So yeah, just like Dr. Wallendael said, so you can kind of Google and see, okay, this is what I'm looking to do and the type of therapy that I think that I'm interested in. These are some, you can first to kind of find who maybe started that, or where that therapy is right now in the field, and read more about it, and also learn more about kind of the process of what types of programs should you be looking at, or maybe here's a list of schools where they focus on that particular type of therapy.
Okay, Sophia had another question specifically for you, Dr. Lyerly. You mentioned your friend did a gap year program. Can you talk more about these kinds of programs if you know anything about what they did?
Yeah, so my friend, she went to App State as an undergrad, and she was part of their honors program, so she did an honors thesis. And her thesis advisor, had a connection it was USC, South Carolina, not Southern California, who was in the area that she was interested in. And so through that connection, she was able to work there. And I can't remember now if she was paid or if it was just something that she volunteered and just worked, another job while she did that. But anyway, so she worked in his lab for about a year, and then she applied to work under him into that doctoral program. So it was definitely, again, for her, because her GRE was really, really pretty bad. But I think it was definitely really, really helpful for her in terms of being able to get in. And, the program there at USC, it was actually a pretty good program. So it wasn't like a formalized gap year program, but it was just, again, through a connection that she had, which, again, getting back to how important it can be to really connect with faculty and get involved in research, that allowed her the opportunity to work for this person who ended up being her mentor for her doctoral program.
A question from Brianna. Does the research assistantship normally last a semester?
If you're going to sign up for credit to get research credit in Psych 3806, that goes on a semester by semester basis. But usually what'll happen is you won't sign up and have a research project that is going start to finish in that semester. Most faculty members with research labs have a number of projects going on that are in various stages of completion. And when you join a lab, you could get in on something that's just starting, or you might be assigned a role in something that's been collecting data for a while. But if if you get involved in a lab, many lab directors would like you to stay on for more than one semester, because the first semester will almost be, at least a large portion of it will be training you for what it is that you're going to be doing. So if you can do at least a second semester or even a third, you'll get more into what's happening in the lab and get, kind of a feel for more of how a project goes start to finish, because very few research projects actually get finished up in a semester's time.
And a lot of times too, if you are able to be in a lab for more than one semester, you can get different experiences too, right? As you get involved in research, you'll learn there's so many different pieces. So maybe your first semester you're helping with data entry, and then your second semester, you might be able to do some additional things. So generally, if you are involved in that for longer, you can be doing different things. It wouldn't be the same thing the whole time.
Okay, sorry, I'm just gonna mute myself real quick because I had basically, I'll be taking Research Methods 1 I'm hoping this summer, and then the second one in fall. So I'll be graduating this semester after spring 2022. So would you recommend just staying another semester, since you're saying that normally the research labs take longer than a semester? So maybe I could do have that extra semester and then do another couple TA positions that would look good for grad school. Like, how do you think I should go about that?
There's a couple of ways that you could do it. One possibility might be to take, both methods 1 and methods 2 over the summer, and, during that time be reaching out to labs and so forth. But the difficulty is that, a lot of people will kind of have their labs firmed up. Probably, if you're looking at like joining a lab for this fall, for instance, even if you had methods 1 and 2 done over the summer, a lot of people will kind of have their labs pretty well set by, the end of the spring semester for the upcoming fall. Now that doesn't mean you shouldn't try, because you never know, when somebody's going to be starting up a new project or, looking for expanding their lab. But it's tricky, to kind of get involved quickly. And, it's one possibility would be, to kind of, build a sort of gap year into your plans where, you would, maybe not plan on applying to graduate schools during your senior year, but you might actually wait until, after your senior year, when you've maybe had at least a semester or a semester and a summer or something under your belt. Because again, you're going to want to be in a lab long enough that, someone can write a solid letter for you and talk about what it is that you did and how well you performed in the lab and so forth. Because if you have someone who is asking for a recommendation, typically the grad schools will ask questions like, how well do you work independently? And, what's your creativity like, and your oral and written expression? And, those kinds of questions will be easier to answer for somebody who has known you for, more than just a few weeks. Dr. Lyerly, what would you say about that?
Yeah, I would probably say, so again, if you were planning to not take Research Methods 2 until fall, and then you would graduate in spring. So just as we talked about earlier, generally then you wouldn't even, since you would be applying in like late fall or early spring, you wouldn't even be in the lab yet. So you could certainly say, like, assuming you were accepted into a lab, like, oh, I'll be joining so-and-so's lab in the spring. You won't really be able to speak fully to your experience there and kind of what you did. So yeah, I think that's a great idea to maybe think about taking a year off and just getting that additional experience. I think too, it depends on, what types of programs that you're looking at. So again, if you are looking at maybe a more applied master's program, that may not be, again, research is never a bad thing to have that experience with, but it may not be as critical. So if you've had, other types of applied experiences, that could be really beneficial too. So I think it also depends a little bit on like what type of program that you're thinking about.
We have one from Ella. Is it a requirement to take research methods classes before getting accepted for a research lab?
It's not a flat out requirement, but I think most lab directors will want you to at least have finished Research Methods 1 and be in the process of doing Methods 2 before you start working in a lab. But it really is pretty highly variable from one faculty member to another. So, it never hurts to early on make contact with somebody who's doing research in an area that you're interested in, and just ask them, what are your requirements for a student to work in your lab? And, you can tell them flat out, I'm planning on taking methods in next semester. And, I would love to work in your lab at some point. What do I need to be doing now to get ready for that?
And I know some people have on their web pages, so some might even have listed what their requirements are. But yeah, if it doesn't, just as Dr. Wallendael said, you could just reach out and ask what their requirements are, and again, just kind of state your plans and your timeline and see what they say.
We have a question from Adam. I'm a political science major and psychology minor. Would being a political science major impact my ability to get into grad school for psychology?
So I would say, again, depends on what kind of program you're looking at, Adam, but I would say in general, probably not. So assuming you are a minor, you'll have sort of the basics or, some foundation in psychology. You could look on your whatever programs you're looking at. Sometimes they will say, like, if they require a degree in a certain area or certain courses, often there may not be a requirement for a degree, but they might say, oh, we really want people to have taken, these psychology courses or whatever. So that would be one thing to think about. I think another thing, just in general, not just in psychology, but again, in general, fields are so much more interdisciplinary. So, in that sense, I don't think that coming from a political science background really puts you at a disadvantage. It just kind of gives you maybe a different perspective or something different that you could add. So, I would say with that, you probably definitely, really want to get those outside of class experiences. So again, the research, the teaching assistantships, whatever those might be in psychology, to really show that, hey, this was my major was political science, but I really have this interest and background in psychology.